So I'm often told that my mama raised a diplomat, and many of my colleagues in the environmental justice community often know that I am a bit of a cooler head than some of others. But I have a few things to say, and then I'll delve into my presentation. I wanted to actually ask a question ahead to take some of the heat off of, I think his name was Brother Bill Johnson? Jefferson, Bill Jefferson. Because there was a lot of energy directed at him, no pun intended. But a couple of things that he, and I think it's important for you as members of the NAACP as we have this conversation, to also think about and be clear about with regards to the nuclear industry. Nikki touched a little bit on this when he said that there are extraordinary costs to building nuclear energy plants. And that is very real, okay? And when we talk, I applaud Lonnie Johnson, I think I got your name right, yeah? I applaud Lonnie for pointing out the fact that all energy choices have particular risk. And what we are engaged in as a nation when we seek to sustain our energy consumption in the form that it is right now, which is another question and another conversation, not for now, we are taking calculated risk. But those calculated risks are often sometimes skewed by the political power and clout of particular industries that push our policy. Now, with all due respect to the oil and gas industry, they have the largest lobby on Capitol Hill, okay? They make the most money of any industry. And there was a big debacle the other day about oil industry and gas prices, and the Democrats trotted people up to the hill. And I will tell you, it to me was a low point in our national political dialogue, because the oil industry and gas prices that you pay at the pump are really separated. They're two different things, so don't fall for that okey-doke. There's a problem there, and we can deal with that, but it's not about what the oil industry is specifically doing. One of the things, though, I would like a debate on Capitol Hill, just like if we could have a debate about steroids in baseball on Capitol Hill, I would like a debate where our Congress actually looks at the amount of money that's spent by lobbyists, spent on lobbyists, to preserve oil industry's subsidies. Because something else that Mr. Johnson said that I take a little bit of exception to is that it is true, he is right, that today, if we set out to say that all of our power would be generated from wind or solar or some other renewable source, that we wouldn't be able to do that. And there are reasons that we wouldn't be able to do it. We wouldn't be able to do it because part of the resources in a limited budget pie, right, are in some instances devoted to propping up the continued use of oil and gas. That's my contention. It's also the contention of others. Some of the resources are out there not modernizing and helping to further build the grid infrastructure that's necessary to make the transmission of wind power possible, right? More effectively to more parts of the country. That's another problem. And I'll touch a little bit on that in terms of when I come back up to talk about sort of US energy policy. But there are other parts of this story that have to be exposed, and one of the parts of this story is that there is a significant effort on the part of the oil and natural gas industry to maintain their interest, which is about making sure that the subsidies that come to them and the ability to continue to make the profits that they do is sustained. And I get that, I really do. I don't think, however, that is in the interest of this country, because I think that the sustenance of that kind of subsidy is one of the very barriers that needs to be broken if we are indeed to sort of change the equation, which Mr. Johnson rightly pointed out, and actually comes from the Energy Information Authority of the US government, that by 2030 we will still have a significant dependence on fossil fuels. And if we are to change that picture, then I think you, as members of the NAACP, need to be aware of how your tax dollars are being used. Now, to be fair to the oil industry, this is the diplomat in me, they're not breaking any laws, and the government does provide those subsidies. They, as all industries do, are seeking to protect their interests. The fault, in some measure, is not theirs, and I do not blame them. I place that burden on two groups squarely. One is us. That is U period, S period. And that comes in two forms. The United States government and us as the people of the United States. So that's the first thing I would have to say, and I hope that was somewhat fair and balanced.
I would take exception to the subsidy thing.
Oh, I knew you would, but that's okay. Do you want to tell us? No, let me stop.
I would gladly tell you.
No, let me stop. Let me stop. The second issue is with regards to the nuclear industry and Brother Jefferson. Yeah, 5 minutes, well. And Brother Jefferson. Part of the cost of supporting the nuclear industry is not just about building the nuclear plants. It's not just about the waste disposal issue, right? Which is on the federal dime, right? Finding a repository for nuclear waste in this country is on the federal dime. That's why Yucca Mountain is in the news and the government is connected to Yucca Mountain. Now the oil industry doesn't have a Yucca Mountain to my knowledge, right? Do you guys? No, right? And no comment on that one.
We're going with your facts.
Okay, all right, great. So the oil industry doesn't have a Yucca Mountain, and by that I specifically mean the disposal issues with regards to petroleum residue in some portion certainly rest with the corporate sector to deal with, okay? Nuclear industry, however, does have another cost that the federal taxpayer bears. When the nuclear industry first got going, and it sought to get insurance for its product, let's say, the insurance industry would not, in many respects, take on that risk. And so as a result of that, a series of efforts and federal initiatives came into play. And part of what we do as federal taxpayers is that we subsidize the insurance cost of operating the nuclear industry in this country. It is something that helps keep the price of nuclear power artificially low. Or I should say, artificially lower in comparison to other sources of energy. So I wanted to make sure that you were aware of that as well. Now, in the 3 minutes that I have left, I was supposed to talk to you a lot about sort of health impacts of some of our energy sources. I have to apologize to you, and Jackie and I will remedy this, but I was away for a funeral and didn't see an email that said get your PowerPoint in by Monday, and so I didn't do that. But I have a PowerPoint, and had you been able to see it, I would have opened up with a map of the world. I have two questions for you. One is, how do you define a continent? Does anyone know? I need a quick answer since I have a little bit of time. How do you define a continent? What did they teach you in school about defining a continent? Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
A large body of land surrounded by water.
Excellent. A large body of land surrounded by water. That's general knowledge, right? This is something that we learned in school. Next question. How many continents in the world are there? Yes, ma'am. Yeah, you can go ahead, Felicia, because it's got to be quick. Yes?
7.
You are wrong. Or?
6.
There are no 7. There is only 6. And the reason being, a lot of the point of this exercise is to tell you that oftentimes what we are told and taught, and sometimes even when we have evidence of a map in front of us, we don't sort of seem to break through some of the myth, spin, and propaganda. There are 6 continents in the world. Often people refer to Europe as a continent, and it is actually part of the Eurasian continent. So that is one thing that you will have learned from my presentation. The second thing I wanted to say to you is that when it comes to issues around the oil and gas industry in the United States, it stands alone not only in its profits, but it also stands alone in terms of the amount of solid and liquid waste that it creates and generates, as opposed to all other categories of waste, including municipal, agricultural, mining, and industrial waste. And even if you combine those other forms of waste, the oil and gas industry stands head and shoulders above them. Oil and gas drilling and pumping produce most of the sector's waste. So when you look at just sort of some of what Vernice was talking about, waste is a very big issue. But I wanted to focus a little bit on some of the health impacts of the oil and gas industry. Now this comes from the US Environmental Protection Agency. And one of the things that they say is that oil and natural gas production facilities emit pollutants such as hazardous air pollutants and volatile organic compounds. These pollutants can contribute to health problems that may affect facility employees and the community. And I think it's important for us to recognize, you, the members of the NAACP, that you probably fall into some of those groups if you're not a member of a community or someone who works in a facility for sure, that you may know some of these people. And while regulations limit the emissions from these facilities, dangerous releases of HAPs, hazardous air pollutants, can occur if a facility does not operate in compliance with EPA regulations. That last piece there, a facility that doesn't operate in compliance with EPA regulations. I would have shown you at this point some pictures of the BP oil disaster. Well, that was something that didn't operate within compliance, right? I would have also shown you the facility of an oil refinery that didn't fireproof some of its pipes. That too was a facility that didn't operate within compliance. So we know that we're taking particular risk when we take certain energy choices, and that there are certain consequences, absolutely. But what are some of the health impacts, very specifically? This I wanted you to write down. One of the chemicals that comes from the oil production and natural gas process is a chemical known as benzene. Benzene's health effects, according to the US EPA and according to the Department of Health and Human Services, are irritation of the skin, eyes, and upper respiratory system. Long-term exposure to benzene can cause blood disorders, reproductive and developmental disorders, and cancers. Another chemical in this production process, toluene. Its exposure to toluene over a long time may cause nervous system effects, irritation of the skin, eyes and respiratory tract problems, dizziness, headaches, difficulty sleeping, and birth defects. Now, that is two chemicals that come out of this process. Ethylbenzene is another. Short-term exposure to that can cause throat and eye irritation, chest constriction, and dizziness. Long-term exposure to it can cause blood disorders. Another chemical, xylenes. Short-term exposures has high levels of short-term exposure to high levels of xylenes can cause nausea, vomiting, gastric irritation, and neurological effects. Long-term exposure may impact the nervous system. So those are xylenes, right? Then you have volatile organic compounds that come out of this processes. Volatile organic compounds are released in the production of oil and gas. Chemicals in volatile organic compounds can form ground-level ozone, better known as smog to people, and that can cause breathing difficulties, especially in the young and the elderly with existing difficulties in their respiratory systems. Last chemical that I'll talk about, N-hexane. Short-term exposure to N-hexane can cause giddiness, nausea, dizziness, and headache. And long-term exposure can cause numbness in extremities, muscular weakness, and blurred vision. All of these are things that can be readily found on government websites like ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the Environmental Protection Agency. My next slide would have shown you one of the sources of the problem, which was refineries. So it was interesting to hear Mr. Johnson say that he was at the Baytown, Texas refinery. Well, Baytown, Texas is one of the 7 most seven most problematic refinery towns, along with Beaumont, Texas, Texas City, Texas, Corpus Christi, Texas. Unless you think I'm picking on Texas, Texas actually controls a significant amount of the infrastructure for refining petroleum product in the United States. And so that's why they also have as many of them as listed here. Many of us work with a colleague out of a place called Port Arthur, Texas, and we could go on about Texas, as well as others in Houston and so forth. So Baton Rouge, Louisiana, you heard Vernice talk about Cancer Alley. Baton Rouge is at the northern end of Cancer Alley. Whitting, Indiana, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Now, several of these towns and cities, like Baton Rouge and Philadelphia, Beaumont, Texas, for instance, right around the refineries, why have I focused on those? Right around these refineries, there are exceedingly high concentrations of African Americans. In Beaumont, Texas, the immediate population right around the refinery, 95% African American. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, this is a major city, just north of where the airport in Philadelphia, a colleague that we have worked with over a number of years, Mabel Mallard, a community there that has about 75% African Americans. Okay, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana is a city where there's a 50% African American population. And so concentration around that particular refinery is probably high as well. But these are towns, and in the case of some of them, there have been explosions of refineries, and yet another health consequence. When these facilities sort of explode, communities are really treated to sort of a deluge of toxic air, apart from just the regular operations that go on a regular basis. And so when we talk about some of these issues with regards to health impacts, I wanted to be clear with you that there are very specific toxic chemicals that come out of these processes, toxic emissions that come out of these processes. And I wanted to make sure that you knew more about that. On the issue of coal, and then I will stop. On the issue of coal, coal has lots of toxic metals in it. It's got radioactive elements, it decays to radon. Even low sulfur coal produces biotoxic sulfur, and it acidifies water. Again, coal has benzene. You heard about benzene when I talked about the oil and gas production process, and benzene derivatives. And benzene is a known carcinogen. Coal is also toxic because it's got arsenic. It's a known poison and leads to various cancers and lymphoma. It's got lead in it that affects almost every body system. Coal is also a problem because mercury is a byproduct of coal combustion in particular power plants where it is burned. And my colleague Nikki Sheets, Dr. Nikki Sheets that you heard earlier, is probably the greatest champion of what we call co-pollutants, and we'll talk about that at another point. But coal also has cadmium, vanadium, and selenium, all of which have very significant health effects associated with them. And a growing body of medical studies shows that you could experience higher rates of premature death, congestive obstructive pulmonary disorder, lung cancers, other heart, lung, and kidney diseases, as well as congenital abnormalities and hospitalizations. Just increase levels of hospitalizations even after adjusting for other factors. This is what some people are exposed to. And if you live near a coal mine, as not that many African Americans do, but certainly people of color do, and certainly folks who are low income, Caucasian brothers and sisters, and those who work in the coal mines, never to be forgotten, are often not just exposed to occupational injuries and illnesses, but higher rates of cancer, hospitalization, COPD, which is congestive obstructive pulmonary disorder, hypertension, and childhood asthmas. So coal, too, is a serious problem, and it's the #1 source of mercury that comes from US coal-fired power plants. This mercury builds up in fish and then gets onto our plates, especially for those of us in our communities who are living close to subsistence and sometimes fishing from the rivers and waterways near them. It disrupts fetal development, and it is a potent neurotoxin. So all of these are things that are very clearly documented scientific health effects of some of the byproducts. Now, I want to be clear and say to you, we could talk about wind, we could talk about solar, we could talk about some of the other forms of alternative energy, and I agree with Mr. Johnson that there are risks. For example, in the production of solar panels, there are many chemicals that are in the cells themselves, and exposure to those could be equally toxic, okay? So I want to be fair and balanced. But the reality is that if we're talking about risk, if we're taking calculated risk, there, in my mind for sure, is a clear differential between the risk of the old fossil fuels, whether you talk about health effects and or climate change impacts, or just waste issues, versus the health effects, waste issues, or climate change effects of alternatives. So I think I'm way over time and I have a lot more to say, but I'll stop there.